became quite a famous case. Cycling costume contest, Kittie Knox not wearing a long skirt, and Kittie Knox being a black biracial woman, and literally got onto the wire services and was published all over the country.
Hello and welcome to the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation in Waltham. My name is Steve Guerrero and I'm the Director of Education here. So Waltham, since 1813, has been a hub of manufacturing, and part of that story is bicycle manufacturing, particularly the Metz Corporation that manufactured Orient brand bicycles, motorcycles, later cars, and he dreamed of doing air cars but never got to it. But tonight we're here to talk about a groundbreaking cyclist with a groundbreaking scholar. I'm here to introduce Lauren's Larry Finison, who is the author of Boston Cycling Craze, 1880 to 1900, and has done some important scholarly research in uncovering and bringing to a wider audience the story of Kittie Knox. Kittie Knox is a local. She was born in Cambridge. She grew up in the West End, and in her short 26-year lifespan, pushed against gender and racial constraints of her time in the 1890s. And tonight we're excited to hear from Larry on that. Larry.
Thank you very much, Steve. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you tonight on a topic that I've been obsessed with for the last 15 years or so. And it's really a delight to discover new things every year and be able to come out and talk about them. Anyway, I've got 3 books out, and the one with Kittie Knox in it is this Boston Cycling Craze. There she is. She really forms the spine of the book, the main character, and I bring in all the context around her. Then the other 2 books get into more modern history, 20th century, and I continue to work mainly in the area of Kittie Knox and trying to push her memory and her legacy. So I want to acknowledge the museum, also the Lowell Institute, Mass Bike, who's been with me along this journey, as well as the New England Cycling Coalition for Diversity. And there are people from both those organizations here tonight. Also Plays in Place. We're doing some plays about Kittie Knox, and one of the staff people, Morgan Henderson, is here from Plays in Place. Galen Mook is here from Mass Bike, and Randolph Williams is here from the New England Cycling Coalition for Diversity. And so they've been very supportive, and we'll talk a little later about what they're doing. So let me talk a little bit about Kittie Knox. First of all, to introduce her, she was a courageous young cyclist of the 1890s and experienced limitations due to her race and gender, the type of dress she wore, the type of bike she rode on, and the speed with which she rode it. And we'll have a chance to look at all of those aspects of her life. Basically, for those of you who don't know the history of the bicycle, the real beginnings occurred in 1878. First here in Boston, that is first in the U.S. here in Boston. European riders were going on quite a bit before that. There was the bicycling boom, or bicycling craze from the 1890s, and then a real bust starting about 1900, where baseball and football begin to eclipse cycling as the most popular sport in America. And a mini boom in the 1930s, and then finally the Renaissance starting in the 1970s, and I think we're still kind of in that as we speak. So there's the Boston Bicycle Club, the first in the nation. They're gentlemen all, and in fact their constitution said no one but a gentleman can belong, which means nobody who actually works on bicycles for a living can belong to the Boston Bicycle Club. Although if you're a manufacturer, that's okay. But nobody who works in a bicycle shop, nobody who actually races for money was allowed to be a member of the Boston Bicycle Club. So that's where it kind of started with the old high wheelers. And then As you can see, the transition from the high wheelers and the old tricycles to the modern safety bicycles occurred in the late 1880s and the early 1890s. So that shows the transition of the bicycle over a period of about 20 years. And here's a combination of high wheelers and safety bicycles standing on the dock at Cottage City on the Martha's Vineyard. It's now known as Oak Bluffs. So I'm sure everybody here has probably sailed into Martha's Vineyard and come off the dock. Well, they're all standing there kind of awaiting either to be picked up by their owners or to be taken back onto the boat. And probably waiting to be picked up by their owners because at the same time, the League of American Wheelmen's Massachusetts division met for a period of about 10 years at Cottage City and had their grand balls and grand meets in this big barn, since burned down, right there at Cottage City. And quite a wonderful, wonderful time. You'll notice there's a woman standing in the kind of front left side in a very long skirt. And the traditionalist women of the time and the men said that's all you could wear was a long skirt and ride on a lady's bicycle, drop frame. Even though that made things very difficult because you had to bear the extra weight of the long skirt and also the extra tubing, the extra heavy tubing from the lady's bicycle, because to be as strong as a diamond frame, it had to have a little extra oomph. So it was a very heavy and awkward kind of thing to do. But there they all are at their statewide meet, which typically happened in August of each year. I want to talk a little bit now about Kittie Knox herself. Her father was a black tailor from Philadelphia. Her mother is a white woman mill worker from East Parsonsfield, Maine. They were married in New Bedford. How they met and married there, I have no idea. We're still trying to figure that out. Her brother was born in Somerville in 1872, and Kittie was born in Cambridge in 1874. And there's Kittie Knox's Boston. The State House is here, Boston Common. There's her house in the 1890s. There's her house in the earlier period when she was in grade school, just across the West Boston Bridge, which is eventually torn down and is now Longfellow Bridge, crossing the Charles River. And it's neat to see the people rowing up and down, racing up and down the Charles River. And I suspect that since she lived so close by, she probably got a chance to see both the high wheelers racing across the bridge and also the rowers racing up and down the river. And I'm sure that helped her to appreciate speed, which is something she certainly exhibited later on in her life. Riverside Cycle Club had a meeting house over in Cambridge, right on Main Street in Cambridge. And then just beyond that is the Cambridge Cycle Park, which became quite well known in the 1890s. There's her birthplace along the Broad Canal. Now it's a place where a kayak rental place occurs. If you ever go by there, you'll see this is 3rd Street Bridge going across. Doesn't exist any longer. It's now all kind of bricked in. But it was a place where small ships came in from Maine carrying lumber, and ships came in from Pennsylvania carrying coal to supply the needs of Cantabrigians. She lived right there. So she went to the Alston School in Cambridge through the 8th grade and attended Broadway Baptist Church, which no longer exists. And she did her singing and recitation there and learned sewing and dressmaking at home, clearly from her mother, who was a seamstress as well, and her father, who was a tailor. And there's the West Boston Bridge again. If you look closely, you'll see the horse cars coming across it. Her home is way in the distance. In the early 1890s, she and her mother, her father died by that time. She and her mother and brother crossed the West Boston Bridge to the west end of Boston, where she lived during the 1890s. and that's her neighborhood in the West End. Unlike the Cambridge neighborhood, which was a lot of immigrants, but all white, pretty much. In fact, the census taker made a little note in the bottom of the 1880 census for her block saying that, quote, this was the only colored family in the section. That was certainly not true when she got to the West End, because the West End was full of immigrants. Eastern European Jews were fleeing persecution. Black migrants from Virginia and other places in the South who were fleeing harassment from wanting to vote. People from both black and white Canadians were immigrant there looking for work and fleeing away from Nova Scotia, which was very poverty-stricken at the time. So there was a very mixed neighborhood. There were a very large number of biracial marriages and biracial children in that neighborhood. In fact, the highest rate of any neighborhood in the city and, in fact, of the country. I think the statistic is something like 35% of black marriages were interracial in that particular era. That was not to last. She got into dancing in a big way at the various winter balls that were held by the West Enders, the Coachman's Ball, and particularly important, an organization called Company L of the 6th Massachusetts Volunteer Militia, which is akin to the State Guard, the National Guard today. It was a state institution. It was all black. It had its own black officers, which was very unusual at the time, and it also had its own bicycling unit. So, in fact, each of the New England contingents in the National Guard had their own bicycling units. This one was largely made up of the members of the Riverside Cycle Club, which was an all-black club in Cambridge and the West End of Boston during the 1890s. There's the Riverside Cycle Club and their logo printed up with all the other club logos in the Boston Globe in 1893. And here's a very interesting column. This appeared in the Indianapolis Freeman, which was a black newspaper out of Indianapolis. And they had kind of volunteer correspondents all over the country who would write in little notes about what was going on. And clearly there was some correspondent for the Indianapolis Freeman on Martha's Vineyard and made a note about Kittie Knox in 1893, along with her friend Viola Wheaton, labeled as two of Boston's fair ones are active members of the Riverside Bicycle Club. They are graceful riders. And I'm sure with all of her dancing experience, she learned to be a graceful rider as well. The column was called the Summer Girls column. The 1890s was a tough time, particularly tough time. Racism really worsened during that era. Increasing harassment was happening. The federal elections bill of 1890 was voted down by the U.S. Senate by one vote and really brought in a whole wave of repression all over the country. The bill was not, it was sort of put on the shelf and finally taken off in 1965 when it was passed as a version of the Elections Bill of 1965, Voting Rights Act of 1965. So anyway, there was increasing harassment, a lot of demeaning cartoons, songs, parade floats, minstrel shows, and even and particularly among cyclists who were wanting of entertainment in the wintertime, they would put on quite demeaning minstrel shows, and as well, there are many pieces of sheet music written for bicyclists, or written about bicyclists, which had very demeaning covers on them, demeaning towards black cyclists. So it was a tough time, and all of this spread throughout America. It was a very tough time to be riding if you were black And not only that, but the League of American Wheelmen, over a period of a couple of years, instituted a color bar to ban members who were not white. It was initiated by the Louisville wheelman, a man named William Watts, and there were protests by particularly the Massachusetts delegation and some others, but they didn't work, and it was finally voted through on the promise that if they voted it through, then the southern delegations would increase in number, since they wouldn't have to see black riders on the road. They would increase their membership in the League of American Wheelmen, and that would help the League to promote good roads, which was a big campaign of the League of American Wheelmen at the time. All of that didn't happen. The southern membership did not rise, and in any case, the Good Roads campaign limped along for a number of years, ultimately been took over by the automobile manufacturers, who were only too happy to have good roads for the automobiles. There were a lot of protests against the color bar. Many of them took place at the Charles Street AME Church. The building still exists on Charles Street, and there's a little, on the right-hand side of it, there's a restaurant now, and the rest of it is office buildings and whatnot. The church itself still exists, but it's now positioned in Roxbury. So the protests of the Riverside Club were particularly strong, and they instructed the delegates from Massachusetts to try to remove the color bar from the whites only bar in the Constitution. A particular person who's important to note here is Representative Timo, who was a black representative of the West End neighborhood, which is Kittie Knox's neighborhood, and the only black member at that time of the state legislature. And he introduced a bill into the legislature decrying the color bar, and it passed, and unfortunately had no effect on the League of American Wheelmen. And it sort of existed in limbo for many years. When the League of American Wheelmen collapsed, it was totally forgotten, and until in the 1980s, it was discovered and formally repealed. The other barrier that Kittie faced, surprisingly, was from women cyclists, particularly the traditionalists, who were gathered around a woman named Mary Sargent Hopkins, who published a magazine called The Wheelwoman, which was the only women's magazine for cyclists in the country. And she was dead set against everything that Kittie Knox stood for, which is to say, she wanted long skirts, not bloomers, ride a drop frame, not a diamond frame or a man's bike, and was death on fast riding, which they called scorching, because it would bring women to a sweat, and which was unladylike, and develop a bicycle face, which was the strain in the face for having strain to go so fast, and also bicycle hump, which was a hump in the back from bending over the handlebars to go fast. So all of these things were anathema to Mary Sargent Hopkins and the ladies gathered around the Wheelwoman. They were so strong, in fact, that the League of American Wheelmen said women cannot race on any sanctioned race in the country. And if a man races at the same meet as the women, he will be debarred from membership in the league. So it was a very tough stance. And it put the promoters in a very difficult position, the race promoters, because on the one hand, they wanted to have a larger audience, and what better than to have the women come in as audience. On the other hand, they couldn't have them race, otherwise they would be debarred by the League of American Wheelmen. So they came up with a kind of an ingenious solution, which is to say they had the races at the track, but instead of races for women, they had a bicycling costume contest. And of course, Kittie Knox was pretty well situated for that because she was a seamstress, and quite an expert one indeed, apparently. There's the Waltham Bicycle Park, where the first cycling costume contest for women was held. The park itself opened in 1893. The contest was held July 4th, 1895, and Kittie Knox won, wearing not a long skirt. And that was troublesome to all the traditionalist ladies in the audience. And she got a lot of hisses, as well as any of the other riders who were wearing not a long skirt. And one of the judges there, Charles Percival, said later he didn't know, but he thought it might have to do with her race, as opposed to her wearing what looked to be bloomers in that particular picture. That was published in the newspapers, local newspapers, in fact, published all over the country. This became quite a famous case. Cycling costume contest, Kittie Knox not wearing a long skirt, and Kittie Knox being a black biracial woman, and literally got onto the wire services and was published all over the country. A couple of days later, Kittie Knox was encouraged to go to the national meet of the League of American Wheelmen in Asbury Park, New Jersey. And so she shows up there. There's a picture of her in one of the big magazines at the time, Bearings, and also a headline in one of the newspapers. This happened to be in the San Francisco Call. So this event, too, made national headlines. And it says, color line drawn, Miss Kittie Knox refused a badge. Well, it caused a huge uproar. The Massachusetts and Boston cyclists in particular were incensed that their Kittie Knox would have been denied, even though she had been a member since 1893, before the color bar was instituted, and succeeded in winning her a badge for the meet, and she enjoyed herself in large part, although she had a lot of obstacles there in terms of finding a place to stay. The Southern Cycler published a piece on her, calling her the, I love this, the murky goddess of Beanville. Her defenders included Charles Percival, who'd been a judge at the Waltham meet, and she ended up dancing at all the league balls, and in fact never was without a partner, apparently. And that incensed some of the ladies in the crowd who threatened to leave the league if Kittie was allowed to stay. She also went out to a long ride to the home of Augustus Zimmerman, who was quite a famous racer at the time and good friend of Major Taylor's, and apparently held up very well and was right up in the lead amongst all the women who were riding that day. And she's in the upper left-hand corner up here in a kind of a jaunty outfit, including bloomers, kind of sitting on the seawall by the ocean at Asbury Park. So she clearly had her fun as well as her struggles while she was there. Well, she came home from Asbury Park and was really welcomed back by much of the Boston leadership, and they made her a pace setter to go out to their statewide meet out at Lake Quinsigamond. And one of the things noted by the newspapers is that there was a big headwind going out to Worcester area, and half of the participants took a train instead, but Kittie Knox stuck it out, and I think of all that as a great example of her perseverance. Well, that fall of 1895 was the fall of the Century Ride. Here she is coasting down a hill in Worcester. So there was a pattern of continuing rejection and acceptance during these Century Rides. There was a Providence ride And again, they had a bad rainstorm during the ride, and about half the participants got on the train to go back to Boston, and she stuck it out, and the newspapers reported that she was muddy but not at all played out after 100 miles on muddy, rainy highways. The next century ride was to Newburyport, and a group called the Boston Wheelmen refused to allow her to ride, even though she'd been registered. There were about a dozen black riders, probably all of them from the Riverside Club, and they were refused admission as well, which resulted in a lawsuit. Massachusetts had a public accommodations law at the time, and one suspects they sued under the public accommodations law, but it did not succeed in the end, perhaps because the judge said, hey, a bike ride is not a public accommodation. Who knows? More centuries to Newburyport. Kittie Knox, the young colored girl about whom so much is controversy, rode with the Commonwealth today. Commonwealth Cycle Club was one of the few clubs that had both men and women in it, and there's a long story behind why it did. It's in my book. Encourage you to read it. Newburyport again, the Roxbury Wheelmen barred Negroes from their century run. And so it's back and forth and back and forth. Finally, the Century Road Club of America did a 100-mile ride out in the western suburbs. The riders all went from Boston to Framingham, back to Boston again, and then went from Boston to Newburyport, Boston to Concord and back again, making up 100 miles altogether. And they explicitly advertised it as being without a color bar, which was really kind of a phenomenal way to advertise a ride. But given the context of Boston cycling at the time, one could see why the state centurion, who happened to have been Charles Percival again, put that in the ad. He was slapped down by the national board, and they voted in a whites-only provision to the CRC of A. He was quite indignant about that, and eventually wrote a long column about it in which he complained about the fact that it seemed like the various sports organizations would not admit black members and participants, and the only thing that they were looking for was to have votes on election day from their black ex-members. So that was his protest. Kittie Knox really triumphed in a certain ways. In fact, in a lot of ways. There's an 1896 article about her called Women's Scorchers, all about her fast riding, and the fact that if the League of American Wheelmen had not had an edict against women riding and women racing, she would very likely have been a top racer of the time. She also had some music written, I think, about her. I'm not sure. There were two local Boston blind musicians who put together the lyrics and music for The Coming Woman. Now, The Coming Woman, of course, was, along with The New Woman, was a kind of a slogan of the time for the modern woman who might wear a short skirt or bloomers or knickerbockers and ride a wheel fast. So she had a whole, we think, piece written about her, and some of you may have the sheet music. We also think it's possible that the picture on the sheet music was of Kittie Knox herself. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence of that, but what we don't have is the facial recognition software to tie that down, which I would love to do. I think it might very likely have been her. In any case, we've got the sheet music, and it's quite wonderful. Here's sort of the final lyric of it. Oh, the coming woman of our land, with courage true as steel, is the pretty maid who is not afraid to ride upon a wheel, which I think is a perfect description of Kittie Knox and many of the other modern women, coming women. new women who were active during that time. During that time also, Kittie Knox sort of combined her dancing and cycling interests and became a member of a vaudeville troupe called Isham's Octoroons, which is a very popular and well-known group of light-skinned black performers who performed all over the country, and one of the troupes also performed in Europe. But Kittie Knox performed, we know, at Minton's Theater in New York City, and as well at the Old Howard Theater in Boston, the infamous Old Howard Theater. Kittie Knox was there. She was known as this hub of Boston, and she also did a bicycle race on stage against 4 other women racers, if you can imagine that. Well, I ran across another article published in 1899 called headlined A Double Century. Many of each of the 2 divisions finished. And I discovered, as reading through it, that the double century went from Boston up to Nashua, New Hampshire and back, and then turned around and went from Boston to Newburyport and back. The single century was only Boston to Newburyport and back. So, of course, as I'm reading through this, I know that Kittie Knox's name is in there. And I'm searching for it, and I'm thinking, oh my God, did she do the double century? Alas, no. The next year she died of kidney disease at Mass General Hospital, and she was buried in an unmarked grave in a public lot at Mount Auburn Cemetery, and had basically disappeared for over 100 years till finally knowledge about her resurfaced. And particularly her main family, the Toll family, raised a bit of money and created a marker for her burial site at Mount Auburn Cemetery. And here it is. If you can see at the bottom there, you'll see the burial marker itself with a little bicycle perched on the top of the stone. The people who were there with me in the background, on the left-hand side of the screen, is Jan Brown is one, who is the great-granddaughter of Major Taylor, and who lives in Boston or Cambridge. Nan Toll Millette, who's Kittie's second cousin on the main side of her family, and Linda Lee Rollins, who's the niece of Joseph Gardner Holmes, who was one of the leading riders in the Riverside Club, and also a member of Company L of the 6th Massachusetts Volunteer Militia. And he's also buried not far away from Kittie Knox herself at Mount Auburn Cemetery. This was in 2013 that the stone went up. And Nan Toll Millette also discovered in an old family scrapbook a wonderful photograph of Kittie Knox taken in one of the photo studios down in Washington Street in Boston. And if you're coming along Cambridge Street, you will find Kittie Knox's old house at the corner of Irving Street in Cambridge. It still stands. The bottom floor is now Starbucks. And there are Jan Brown and Nan Millette standing, having a conversation several years ago. So go in and have a coffee and tell people about Kittie Knox. Well, what's her legacy? The League of American Bicyclists in 2020 developed what they call the Kittie Knox Award, which is for champions of equity, diversity, and inclusion in the cycling movement. The first winner was Alicia McGowan, who was the first black professional female racer. And as the award goes, an inspiration to all of us who want to bicycling to be more accessible to people in our communities. Cambridge Crossing, there's a mural of Kittie Knox there, along with 5 other famous women, of Cantabrigian women. This one was drawn by a high school artist in Boston who's now up at the Portland Institute of Art. And quite a wonderful mural. And if you go over to Cambridge Crossing, you'll see it, I'm sure. The Kittie Knox Community Cycle Center is now right near the Leechmere subway stop. And just in back of the REI building, there's a small room, Kittie Knox Cycling Center, little repair tools there, little shower, little changing areas. So people can come in off the subway, hop on a bike, and go to their work, do that last mile to work, or do it the reverse way and have all the things they need. There's the Kittie Knox bike path in Cambridge now. It goes between Binney and Broadway in the back of the Biogen building. Mayor Walsh issued a proclamation honoring Kittie Knox Day, and that was the first annual Kittie Knox bike ride took place on that day, and Mayor Walsh put out a wonderful proclamation for it. City of Cambridge has also put out proclamations for Kittie Knox. And we're on our 4th annual Kittie Knox Legacy Ride, co-sponsored by Mass Bike. Galen Mook is here somewhere. There's Galen Mook, who's head of Mass Bike. And by the New England Cycling Coalition for Diversity. Randolph Williams is here to speak for that organization. And the Kittie Knox Plays, I want to mention those. They're being co-sponsored by Plays in Place. Morgan Henderson is here from Plays in Place. And there are 3 plays that are being developed about Kittie Knox to honor her. And hopefully out of that will come a book that'll have national distribution for high school and college and community theater groups to talk about Kittie Knox and her legacy and the example she really brings of persistence to the and protest to the bicycling world. There are some of our actors in action. This rehearsal happened to be at Landry's in Boston. So summing up, just wanted to remark on her kind of risk-taking courage, her protests, her persistence, all in the context of worsening times for Black residents and cyclists more generally, and for immigrants in America. And finally, to quote a famous American, the arc of history bends towards justice, but I would add, with many steps backward, as in the time of Kittie's life.
Thanks so much, Larry.
Thank
Just
you.
If you have a question, just raise up and I'll come over to you. Please wait till I bring the microphone first.
Thanks. I'm sure it's in your book, but what led you to Kittie Knox in the first place, given she'd kind of disappeared for 100 years? And what other women and or particularly women and girls at her era were racing with her? There was the notice at the beginning of this other person, Viola somebody. Were there other women also in this similar situation, and she was a leader of a couple different groups or not?
I don't think that Viola Wheaton was one of the young women noted at Martha's Vineyard. Also, Benzina Reese was another Black cyclist noted with her at a different part of that summer of 1893. They never show up again, really, in the cycling literature particularly, although it's somewhat hard to tell because the newspaper literature is very sparse then. You see, the piece that I had about her was from the Indianapolis Freeman. There were Black newspapers in Boston at the time. None of them were saved. None of them were saved by the libraries. None of them are in any archives that we know of. So there's a whole rich history of Black history of Boston that's really lost because these old newspapers no longer exist. What led me to Kittie Knox? That's a very interesting question. Let me give you a kind of a short answer to that. Robert Smith wrote a history of bicycling, a social history of bicycling in the 1970s. And in it, there's one line about Kittie Knox. I thought, wow, that's interesting. And then later on, many years later, well-known historian of bicycling, Andrew Ritchie, wrote a book that has several pages about Kittie Knox. And it interested me yet more. Unfortunately, he did not have access to all of the electronic resources that we have, all the newspaper archives and whatnot. So he was very limited in what he could do, although he did brilliantly with what he had. And that interested me still more. And I was out bicycling at the time, and I thought, what an interesting character. And I'm sure, as I think back on it, the fact that I have a biracial daughter interested me as well and got me really going and say, well, what was Kittie Knox's existence like during her time? And maybe thinking about that will help you to think about what's going on today. So I think all of those things kind of came into, and I had a long-standing interest in history and in social history, and so it was an easy transition to get into the history of bicycling.
I'm curious to know how difficult it would have been for her to get a bike and how much it would have cost in today's dollars for a bike, because it seems like there's not that many people out there doing it. So it's kind of cool that she would be so young and having access to a bike.
Well, at the time, bikes went from anywhere from $100 on down. Particularly a used bike could have been had for $5 during her time. And what's unknown really is, to be quite crass about it, is how much money did she have? On the one hand, her family was not well-to-do, apparently. On the other hand, as skilled tailor, seamstress, and whatnot, she would have done fairly well, I believe, particularly as a dressmaker. The fact is that she was down in Martha's Vineyard for the summer, like in 1893. Well, what was she doing down there? Was she vacationing? Was she working? Could have been either. In fact, since it was such a great resort area at the time, all of the various organizations, including the Cyclists, would be having their summer resort meetings down there and dancing at the balls and whatnot. So the services of seamstresses and dressmakers would have been quite in demand. So it may be that she was doing some combination of working and playing in Martha's Vineyard. And it's hard to say for sure. We have no information about how wealthy I don't think they were wealthy at all. I know that her mother, while she was still alive, was taking in boarders in their home at the corner of Irving and Cambridge Street, which to me is an indication that they're not destitute, but they're probably not a wealthy family.
So my question is, was biking at that time strictly recreational and racing, or did people commute on bikes?
Biking was all three. It was a racing enterprise, it was a recreational enterprise, and it was also a commuting enterprise. And there's one fabulous story about the attempts of the cyclists to put a cycle path across Boston Common, kind of diagonally across Boston Common, which would be of great use to cycling commuters who were coming out of the South End to go into their offices in the financial district. The ladies of Beacon Hill rose up in righteous anger at the thought that the bicyclists would be going through the Boston Common, and it was eventually the mayor called public hearings to examine the problem, and then didn't show up himself. He was so afraid of the reaction. So, but yes, commuting was part of the action, and particularly coming over from Cambridge into Boston and coming from the South End into the West End of the financial district, commuting was part of the action. It was difficult cycling on the streets of Boston at the time because there were the horse-drawn wagons and carriages made the streets extremely slippery, as you can imagine, and so the desire for a path across Boston Common that the horse-drawn carriages could not travel on.
This is sort of a half-comment question. My mother was born in 1919, and she referred to it as her wheel, not, I mean, we call it a bicycle, and I wonder if that is really the case, and is that why they were called wheelmen, was because you called it your wheel?
It's very interesting because if you think back on that song, The Coming Woman, the last phrase in it about the pretty maid who is not afraid to ride upon a wheel. And indeed, that was the phrase most frequently used. They were either called cycles or wheels, or in many cases, particularly amongst the gentleman riders, they were referred to as their steeds of steel. And the reason for that is that's a throwback to the fact that many of the older men who were involved in cycling may also have been Civil War veterans. And who knows, members of the cavalry. So that kind of throwback to the chivalrous days of the cavalry, I think, resulted in this notion that what they had was not a bicycle, it was a steed of steel. That's tough, right? That's resilient. Yeah, that was a very good question. I like that.
I was wondering about the technology available at the time and when pneumatic tires were standard on bicycles. These were all air-filled tires that people were using on bicycles during the time you're talking about.
What kind of tires they were using?
Air-filled tires were standard at that time, were they?
Well, gradual transition from the 1880s where they were hard rubber tires to what were called cushion tires, which are a little bit softer, to inflatable tires. By the early 1890s, they were beginning to have the inflatable tires.
And Kittie Knox would have been riding a bike with inflatable tires?
Very likely so.
Yeah.
Because they became popular very quickly since they were faster.
And the high wheelers were kind of gone by that point?
High wheelers were out.
Yeah.
For a period of about 3 years, they were running 3 divisions within all the racing meets. They were running high wheelers, tricycles, and safety bicycles. And by 1893 or so, only the safety bicycles were left because they were faster, and people were attracted to going faster. Now, in terms of the rims, there were steel rims, but there were also hickory rims that were in use at the time. And in fact, a local person here, Sterling Elliott, who lived and had his manufacturing plant over just across the river in that little enclave of Watertown that's on the other side of the Charles River, was a famed manufacturer of hickory wheels. He was also president for a year or two of the League of American Wheelmen. And the thing to know about him is that he represented in his own stances the transition from supportive of Kittie Knox and the rights of black cyclists to being adamantly opposed within about 2 years after his ascension to power in the League of American Wheelmen. So he kind of exemplifies or symbolizes that transition to worsening times for black cyclists and worsening times in general in America.
You mentioned that Kittie Knox was performing as part of a bicycle troupe at one point. Can you talk more about that? I think you mentioned they were racing on stage.
Yes, well, that was she was racing on stage with Isham's Octoroons, and as far as I know, just performed in New York, as I said, at the Minton Theater and at the Old Howard in Boston. They actually had little bicycle races on stage. How they did it, I have no idea, but they're probably cycling on fairly small cycles. But in any case, there's an intriguing note in one of the bicycling magazines saying that Kittie Knox has just returned from Paris, where she did many graceful turns on the wheel. And I thought, well, what does that mean? Was she in Paris, Maine? Or was she really in Paris, and was she part of an Isham's Octoroons performance in Paris? Or maybe some cycling reporter just made it up. We don't know. There's no record of her in the ship's registers, such as they exist, going back and forth at that time. But it's an intriguing question, and I would love to have somebody else find the answer to it.
Is it known why she died or how she died?
She died of kidney disease at Mass General Hospital. It was just down the street from her house. And it's unknown how she contracted it. A couple of things about that. One is that I have tried over the last 3 or 4 years to get a hold of the records from Mass General Hospital. And of course, with all the privacy restrictions, they say, no, you're not going to get a hold of that. And so I don't think it's likely that I will. I'm speculative that it's possible that her occupation as a seamstress and dressmaker may have brought her into contact with some of the solvents and other chemical materials that might have had an impact on her kidney health and led to her death. It's just speculation, and I'd love to find some good chemist who would help with that investigation as well.
So you showed a picture of the Waltham racing track, or
Yes.
How many other racing tracks for cyclists were there in this area? Were they widespread, and was that something people then paid to go see? I just hadn't heard of. I know there was a horse racing track in Cambridge, but I had never heard of specific bicycle racing tracks in the area. How
Well,
many others were there?
there were many. There were actually quite a number of bicycle racing tracks in Massachusetts and across the country. Quite a number of them were shared tracks with the horse tracks. In other words, they'd race horses on them, and then the cyclists would race on them as well, although it would be very difficult because of the muddy and dirty conditions of the tracks. So there were some that were made that were very specifically for cyclists, and I believe that the Waltham track was one of them. The Cambridge cycle track, where Major Taylor raced, is another one. And there was a board track that was built in Revere. It was really quite a famous board track, and that went on through the 1930s. And it was run by Nat Butler, who himself was a great racer and knew Kittie Knox back in the 1890s, and raced as a part of a team with Major Taylor as well. So that was quite a wonderful track. Unfortunately, people got maimed because it was a small board track, and they were paced by fast cyclists, then tandems, then triplets, then quadruplets, and finally with motor pacers. And the motor pacers would wreck the tracks, and the cyclists would fall and get splinters all up and down their arms. And it was quite a dangerous occupation to be a professional bicycle racer at the time. But yes, there were tracks, both borrowed tracks from horse racing and standalone tracks to some degree, until bicycling really went down in the early 1900s. And then there was no more claim for them. The Waltham and Cambridge tracks went out of business in the early 1900s, both as a result of deaths due to motor pacers of the time.
Okay, Larry, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you indeed.